Hello, thanks to all of you for being here today for this discussion with Bill McKibben and Marie Toussaint on mobilizing for the climate emergency. I'm Shanny. I'm the director of the Maison Française that organized this event. So please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Bill McKibben.
My basic mission on planet Earth, it turns out, is just to bum people out. And I'll do that quickly and then try to get to a little more hopeful place. But let's just begin by being very honest. If we don't understand the scale and the pace of the problem that we're facing, then the chance of figuring out solutions that arrive at the correct scale and pace is nil. So let me just show you a couple of pictures from the trip I took to Greenland last summer. You all know Greenland is a place of enormous beauty. It's the biggest storehouse of ice in our hemisphere. The ice is a mile thick across much of the great ice sheet. When it melts, Greenland alone has enough water, enough ice to raise the level of the ocean about 23 feet. That's before you do anything in the Antarctic or anywhere else. And indeed, it is melting. It's powerful to see it. We've raised temperature 1 degree. That's caused the damage I've described. That's very near the beginning of this story. We're on a track currently to raise the temperature 3 degrees Celsius, maybe more. If that happens, we cannot have civilizations like the ones we're used to having. The increase in damage from this point will not be linear. 2 degrees won't be twice as bad as 1 degree. The change in damage will be exponential because we're starting to cross a series of very dangerous tipping points all over the world. Hurricane Dorian that camped over the Bahamas for 24 hours, producing what meteorologists called probably the most violent siege of weather ever recorded on this planet, because for 24 hours it spun above the same isolated keys in the Bahamas with the force of an F5 tornado. We have no idea how many people died. We assume thousands because there's 3,500 people missing. There's a story today saying that the damage to the recovery bill for the Bahamas will be above $7 billion on an island whose annual budget for everything is $2.6 billion, okay? Just to give you some tiny microcosm of a sense of what's going on. If we decided to make an all-out effort at transitioning our planet, we couldn't stop global warming. That ship has sailed. But we might be able to stop it short of the place where it cuts civilization off at the knees. That's our task. And here's the part, in a way, that to me gets very depressing. We have the biggest problem we've ever faced. We have a set of solutions that, if they don't solve the problem, at least lead towards the right direction. Why are we not implementing them at the speed with the intent that they require? And that's the answer that Shanny was referring to, I think, when in the introduction. It took me quite a while, too long, to figure out what was going on. I wrote the first book about all this, came out 30 years ago this autumn, but for the first 10 or 15 years, being a good writer and an academic, sort of my theory was we needed more books, and have more symposiums and, whatever else, and eventually the weight of evidence would grow so high that we would win the argument and our leaders would do what needed doing. It took me too long to figure out that we had long since won the argument. By the mid-1990s, there was no longer the slightest doubt of the scientific community about what was going on. We'd won the argument. We were just losing the fight, because the fight wasn't about data and reason. The fight was what fights are always about: money and power. Exxon was the biggest company on earth. They had huge staff of scientists. Their product was carbon. Of course they were going to find out what was going on. And so people dug up documents that showed things like the uncannily accurate predictions for what the temperature and CO2 concentration would be in 2019. They were believed by Exxon's executives. Exxon began building every drill rig they built to compensate for the rise in sea level they knew was coming. What they didn't do was tell any of the rest of us. Instead, they joined with the entire rest of the industry to build this expensive architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that's kept us locked for 30 years in a completely phony debate about whether or not global warming was real, okay? A debate that both sides knew the answer to at the start. It's just that one of them was willing to lie, and that lie becomes the most consequential lie in human history because it costs us the 3 decades when we should have been hard at work on this.
We're now going to hear from our second speaker, Marie Toussaint, who is a graduate of Sciences Po in Paris and a French jurist and specialist of international environmental law.
I'm from the generation that was born with the creation of the IPCC, when the international community affirmed that there was climate change and that the climate change was caused by human action. So I've always grown knowing that the world was coming to a catastrophe. But as I say sometimes, I've been mobilizing since I was born, or almost. And for years, we've been trying to get people mobilized. What I want to tell you maybe as a first message of hope is that when I look at what's going on in France, sometimes we feel like nothing is moving, but sometimes we also see that activism is actually working. In France, we had 2 big projects that we're fighting against. The one is an airport that we fight against since the 60s. So for almost 60 years, we've been fighting against this airport that they wanted to put in the biosphere reserve. And 2 years ago, they just said, okay, this is an old-fashioned project. And maybe the ecologists are right. And maybe it's not even bringing money. And maybe it's really destroying the biosphere. So we're going to stop it. And then last week, we also had another project that was stopped. It's a big commercial center that we've been fighting against for maybe 10 years, so a bit less. But you see that we win the fight also more and more quickly. And this commercial center was aiming at having a ski piste on it, just at the north of Paris. What you do by building this fake ski piste here is precisely what is destroying the snow pistes, the real ones on the mountains, right? And the government said again, okay, maybe the ecologists are right. Maybe this big commercial center is destroying the commerce in the small cities that are around. The emissions that will get out of this project will be killing biodiversity, organic agriculture, and emitting a lot of CO2 emissions. So they stopped it. And it's quite good because it's also giving us hope to follow and keep on fighting. We need to act in civil society and also in the institutions, and that by working together, we can have an impact. Thank you.